All right, welcome back everybody to Sub-Saharan Africa. We'll go through some regions and some specific countries. The outline map you see here, obviously, again, I think I mentioned this before, you don't have to know all 53 countries. So I'll point out a few as we go along the way. And I do expect you to know they're spread out enough where if you have a general area or idea of where they are on the continent, you'll be fine. And I'll make sure I indicate those. Also, there's another attachment that you can download from the Canvas site that has the outline with some kind of notes written on it spatially, and this should help you as well if you want to print that out as this goes through the PowerPoint. You can tell I've got a lot of other things going on in the background as far as getting ready for a couple meetings on campus this week. The first area is the Sahel. Now the Sahel is that transition as you go from North Africa, and then you've got the Sahara Desert that runs across the top of this area, and then it doesn't instantly go from Sahara Desert to tropics. This is kind of that transitional zone. So you've got a little bit of transition in a barrier for both physical attributes of the area and also cultural attributes. And so this makes it kind of a natural split between what's happening in North Africa and what's happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, since the Sahel is right at the edge of the desert, it's very fragile of an ecosystem. The lack of water means that it's really easily subjected to overuse. And so you can see in the photo, this has just been overgrazed by cattle, exposes the soil. That soil will get blown away, and it's no longer really good for agriculture. The process of this area becoming more and more dry and lacking more vegetation is called desertification. It's becoming more desert-like. It's not actually changing the climate. In other words, it's not changing the rainfall amounts, but it's looking more like a desert just simply because it's overused. And so we're seeing the Sahara Desert conditions, not the climate conditions, but the lack of vegetation conditions slowly migrating to the south in some of these areas. It also makes them very, very prone to famine. And so it's often you'll see Niger, Chad, Mali, often having some of the worst famines in the world where thousands of people die from crop failure. It's usually not quite this literal of the sand advancing south, but without the vegetation to block the blowing sand, it can migrate the dunes through the area. Now, West Africa, as you go along this coast from Senegal all the way down to Nigeria, wow, there's a lot of variety here. You had multiple colonizers. You had lots of small tribal groups. The tropical climate also creates a little bit of an isolation from group to group. So there's a little bit of everything here as far as languages, economic development, different economic statuses, different political statuses and stability as you go through here. And Nigeria is the biggest, both in population and in economy. They're a huge oil producer. If you're the 7th largest oil producer, that's saying something. Unfortunately, we're not quite sure where the hell that money is going. It's caught up in corruption and the government wasting money. It's a sad thing that money could have been used for improving the economic conditions of Nigerians, but it just, if anything, kind of sustains it. The capital is at Lagos, and you're seeing a normal picture of a typical day in Lagos in Nigeria. The other country I want you guys to know about is over here, and that's Liberia. Liberia was created in the 1800s by Americans, where they were sending slaves, freed slaves, back to the African continent, thinking that that's where they wanted them to be. But it's kind of strange because the slaves that were brought from Africa to the New World, they kind of lost their tribal associations and were kind of all thrown together. And then that mix of where the slaves were descended from, then being sent back to Africa, was just kind of an odd mix. The USA similarities, when they established their constitution, they based it on the U.S. Constitution. So there's many items in the Liberian constitutions that is verbatim from our Constitution. They've had a recent civil war that kind of destabilized it. They had a president who assumed too much power, and the population rebelled against him. So here we can see the similarities of the Liberian flag, even to the American flag. This is the picture that the family took before heading back to Liberia, to Africa. although I'm assuming that these are descendants of the slaves that were brought over earlier in the slave trade. So when I say back to Africa, it would have been when their ancestors came over, not necessarily them. One of my favorite quotes is urbanism out of control. The population, to give you an idea how crazy things are about Lagos, this is switching back to Nigeria, obviously. The population estimates range between 10 million and 20 million. If you have no idea of how many people are in your city and you're off by 10 million, that's, 100% difference between a 10 million and 20 million. That's kind of chaotic. It's a transient population. They come and go where the work is and where the work isn't. This is on my list of places to see once in my life, just to see the chaos that seems to work. The oil that's in the area, and this applies to another area we'll talk about in a little bit as you head farther south along the coast, is we're not seeing really an equal distribution of the wealth. It's not trickling down to the rural areas, and it's causing some resentment in some areas where the population is pushing back against the oil industries coming into their neighborhoods. And the oil regulations, the countries are really not holding the oil industries to the same environmental regulations that are held to in Europe. So we're often seeing cases of just oil spills being left because the government's getting money out of it, and that's all they care about in the local population. It's at their expense. Shell oil historically has been one of the worst offenders in this. And so you'll have the government military helping Shell oil with their exploration and helping, that's sarcasm, the local villagers be moved out of the way for oil development. I personally never buy Shell oil kind of for some of the things they've done in Sub-Saharan Africa. But, of course, if you're in Ghana, you can always get experimental daycare. Now, West Central Africa, as you head a little bit to the south along the coast, you see this area has oil in the coastal areas as well that extends up into Nigeria. We're equatorial in through here, and so you're going to get tropical rainforest. That's where the ITCZ is, with all that lifting taking place. Dense tropical rainforest through here. It's not as expansive as what you find in South America, but most of it is concentrated in just these areas. We also see some other mineral resources outside of oil. You've got the oil along the coast, and then there's mineral resources that extend down into Zambia and Zimbabwe. Often there's some rare earth minerals in through here as well. It used to be easy to remember which countries had the minerals because it was the Z countries. It was Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Zaire. Well, the civil wars in Zaire led to Zaire being the Congo after the war was over. So they renamed it. The Congo River runs through here. And the odd thing about calling this country the Congo is you may notice the country right next to them has the same name. Typically, if it's the Congo, you're talking about the big one. And usually when people are talking about Congo, they are referring to the one that used to be Zaire, not the other one. Oil, gold, I already mentioned this, that they've got oil. The reason I'm bringing it up here is the same thing as before. We're not seeing that wealth being shared with the general population. The Equatorial Guinea has their own airlines. And really, does Equatorial Guinea warrant enough air traffic that they would get their own airlines? No, it's just simply they've got it for status. That, look, we have our own airlines. Now, East Africa, primarily we're talking about Kenya and Tanzania. These are the ones that are, you're shifting away from the tropical rainforest. And so you've got a transition zone that the tropical savanna has a wet season and a dry season. And this is, when I say classic African landscape, often people who aren't familiar with the variety of landscapes in Africa, if they were trying to visualize something, it would be these large open grassy areas with scattered trees, with these large animals, the megafauna roaming across, the elephants, the zebras, the lions. I mean, all of that is what people would visualize, but this is where it is. Now, part of it is literature. Kenya used to be a British colony, so and South Africa has a similar landscape, that a lot of the literature that came out of British writing styles, which would be common in the United States, characterize this landscape in this way. So it's kind of part of our culture as well. Again, vast open grasslands. Now, the one country in this area is Tanzania, and it's one of the stable states in Africa. When we were looking to book a trip to Africa, one of the reasons that we went to Tanzania was the fact that they are the most stable, the least likely to have a coup or violence or other political uprisings, which has helped their economy grow a little bit. They also have been working on creating an export-based economy so they can bring more money into it. And so they're focusing on coffee, tea, and tourism, and especially the tourism. They've got some offshore islands that are very popular, but also the Serengeti, where you've got those grasslands. They're improving, but why I've got a picture of beer. Now, Mount Kilimanjaro is in Tanzania, but notice it's a lager. Now, lagers are a German beer-making tradition, which would make sense because Tanzania used to be a German colony. So now we're in the East African Rift Zone. This is for all you big geology buffs out there and people who've taken physical geography. This is a divergent plate boundary. This is a rift valley as we're stretching East Africa. You can see a little bit better once you're up above. Also in this area is Oldupai Gorge. So for my anthropology students in here, this is one of the richest hominid sites for fossils in the world going back 2 million years. So best examples of Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and they've got footprints going through recently or fallen ash and mud plains. It's just fascinating. So this is where the Leakeys would have done their research, and it's a fascinating sight to see that so much of it we've learned about human evolution came from this one specific site. And there's a couple of digs in the background that are going on right now. Nothing here in the foreground. The museum, this is the old museum. They were building the new one while we were there, and it just opened last year. And so this is an excuse to go back to Tanzania to see the new museum. So in Serengeti National Park, this is your grasslands, and Serengeti roughly translated as endless plain. And there's a slight curve of the Earth's surface here. And so as you drive across it, that curve, it makes it look like, well, I'm almost finished. I'm almost out of it. Oh, nope, I'm almost. And so as long as you drive, you're still seeing the plane. You're still seeing the plane because of that slight curve in through here. The elephants, very matriarchal. So the head of the group is, the head of the herd is a female. Notice how they've kind of corralled the young elephants in the center to protect them. The only time we kind of ran into any issues was when we got too close to some of the females while we were out on the Serengeti. I hate baboons. That's just a side note. Notice it just seems to go on for days, the planes. What happens with the tourism here, they'll radio each other if there's an animal sighting, even though these are from different tourism groups or tourism organizations. So what they're trying to do is make everybody successful. So all the tourists report that they had wonderful sightings of animals. They're going to have more people who want to come see the animals in Serengeti and be more popular. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming, but other times it was kind of nice because we would get the phone call that something was happening, radio call, that something was happening somewhere. We'd go over and see it. And it's usually for the lions. What's happening here? This is in Ngorongoro, which is next to Serengeti National Park. Ngorongoro, they've got a really rich selection of wildlife here, and they haven't been hunted in this area, so they have less of a fear of humans, and so they tend to get a lot closer. So this is not really a telephoto at all. This is that close to the truck. The lion is waiting for the zebras to come towards them. Zebras aren't stupid. They see the lion, they're going to just simply go the other direction. Lions, on this particular instance, were unlucky. So they came back to the truck because it was nice and shady under the truck. Yes, we are that close to the lion. Yes, that is my daughter sticking her head out the window next to a wild lion. Bad parenting 101. The lions are just comfortable around the trucks. Now, it doesn't mean you can get out because they still look like food to them. So I made her quickly stick her head back in after we took the picture. That elephant, before he's she decided she didn't like us and charged at us. Fortunately, the truck is faster than the elephants. Hippopotami, they group together in these pools. These are the deadliest animals in the tropical savanna. They kill more humans than crocodiles or lions. They're very territorial. They do not like people in their areas. They all sorts of warnings to stay away from the hippos. And the other little fact about the hippos is they smell. Oh my God. I mean, they're basically just kind of wallowing in water that's full of their own piss and poop. So it's not surprising it smells so bad here. The Chinese are active in this area with investment. The Chinese are building some of the road infrastructure in the area. So it seems like it's the Chinese are doing something nice. No, they're building the roads to the mining areas so the Chinese have access to Tanzanian resources. Notice it's a Chinese built truck. And most of the people we saw supervising and a lot of the people doing the construction were Chinese and not Tanzanians. And yes, Lion King is based on the Serengeti, and some of the imagery you see in the Lion King is appropriate to that area. Now, I never did see Simba or see a talking lion, but I did hear people say Hakuna Matata a lot. Moving around north of Kenya to the Horn of Africa, this is again kind of it's a diversity comes from it's kind of a transition between the Middle Eastern states, both north and south. So there's a little bit of everything here. We had different colonizers. You had this oddly shaped Somalia with a hook in it. Somalia, unfortunately, has had a lot of unrest over the past few years in a long civil war. The United States did get involved here, but we're not so good at nation building. We're good at other things, but the United Nations is much better at nation building. To give you an idea of how unstable Somalia is, the government typically meets in Nairobi, Kenya, just because it's safer. Then once a year, they'll go to Mogadishu and have just a symbolic meeting that they're in Somalia, but then they'll go back. They've also got two areas that have declared their autonomy. Puntland is nothing as substantial. Somaliland, excuse me, has had a little bit more success. They're trying to get international recognition. Haven't had it yet, but they've claimed their independence, and they are in control of that area. As you move south to southern Africa, you get another area of tropical savanna, kind of through Botswana and Namibia, Mozambique across here. And then you get a really totally different climate and conditions as you get to South Africa, the country of South Africa. Similar characteristics to what we saw in other areas, and this is really where AIDS is hitting the hardest. Our final country in sub-Saharan Africa is the country of South Africa. This was the main area of white settlement in Africa. For the most part, the climate wasn't appropriate for it. There was a hostile indigenous population. This area, though, had good agricultural land similar to what we would see in Western Europe or the southeastern United States. There's some area of Mediterranean climate over here on the west coast. So we did have white settlement. They were never the majority population, but first that came with the Dutch and the Germans, the Boers and Afrikaners, and then later British settlement in the area. So you can always tell the countries that were settled during the British era, or the cities that were established during the British era: Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, and then I can't pronounce it, word that are the Germanic words that are up and through here from the earlier settlement period. During this time, we also had apartheid. This was the established white majority rule. The African population, the black population, was limited. This obviously was inherently unfair when the black to white ratio was almost 8-1. And so watching all the other countries go through civil wars and independence, there was fear that that was what was going to happen in South Africa. There was also, this went up until the 1990s that this was going on. There was a lot of international pressure for South Africa to allow the black population to vote. So they created kind of a transition plan where they would move out of apartheid and into the allowing the full vote for the entire adult population. This didn't solve all their problems, but it allowed them to avoid a lot of the conflict that other countries saw in the past few decades. This is one of the areas because it was had a lot of ties to Europe. It was one of the early outsourcing for manufacturing, and so we see lots of resources in this area. Unlike a lot of the other African nations, this is one of the richer sub-Saharan African nations. Even without oil, they've got a relatively strong economy compared with other ones, and that why the peaceful transition out of apartheid was so important is that they were able to maintain a lot of that resources and industrial output. And then mid 90s when the apartheid was eliminated. I'll talk about this more when we talk about Australia. I don't like Victorian architecture. And don't drive over the dung beetles, please. All right, that's it for Sub-Saharan Africa. I hope you guys all have a fun journey through the Sub-Saharan. And if you get a chance, go to the Serengeti because it's awesome.